Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. That was very nice. Appreciate that. My name is Rick McCown. I'm from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I have the honor of moderating this session, which is an experiment. So if it blows up, the doors are back there. Save yourselves. The idea is to engage in dialogue. Our colleagues on the panel are folks that have been asked to write essays by Dr. Ball, president of AERA, on the theme, Non satis scire, to know is not enough. So the way I'd like to begin our conversation this morning, and we really do want it to be a conversation, is I'd like to ask each of you to think for a moment about the theme. We're interested in knowing why you're here. I mean, this morning, right now, at this session. And I'd like to begin the session by collecting a thought or a question or a comment or two on the theme, on the essays that you've written, which have been posted on the website of AERA and are still there. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I'd like to know, what do you think of this theme? What are your questions? What comments do you have? What questions might you have for the essayists? I'll ask you to use the mic as we're videotaping. So would you stand and introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Jess Clausen from the University of Florida. And when I was thinking about this theme when I was working on my own paper, I was thinking about the ways that to know is not enough, because education doesn't always combat bigotry, and it can sometimes incite bigotry or increase it or be violent. And so I guess I went directly to a negative place, and I'm sorry for doing that first thing in the morning. But I was just wondering, I mean, a lot of you are really sort of, you're anti-oppression scholars, and I'm just wondering what you think about that idea.
Good, thank you. Any other comments or questions, a thought? Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Virginia Navarro from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And one of the things that I reflected on, I thought I kind of knew what it meant, but then as I reflected more and reading the paper, is that in our anti-science kind of stance, I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm very much of an anti-oppressive person, but I'm getting a little scared about the knowing being, kind of throwing cognition out the window here. So, to know is real important. It's not enough, but I also have kind of gone back on another side of saying I really value knowing. So a little bit of thought on that tension that seems to be right now.
Hi, I'm Julia Williams from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And my question is, I'm interested in early childhood and the knowing and making a difference, impactful difference in working with early childhood teachers and our teacher candidates, how our knowledge can make a more of an impact on our students, our candidates, so that they can make more of a difference in the community with teachers and parents in early childhood settings.
Good, thanks. I think that's good enough to get us started. Well, I'm going to ask our essayists to respond to that or to offer their own thoughts on the issues that have been raised so far. I want to introduce our panel. And first we have Teresa Quinn, Kevin Kumashiro, Erica Miners, Carol Lee, John Walensky, and
Dave Stovall.
Hi, Dave. How are you? Good to see you. I'm from Pittsburgh, Dave, and I don't like that Flyers jacket.
Right.
But we'll get you today.
Indeed.
Okay. So the essayists have had some things to say in their essays, but again, we're looking for some dialogue. So I would ask you to comment on your take on this theme, or to respond to any of the questions or issues that have been raised so far. Please feel free to grab a mic and make your thoughts known.
Well, Carol, I'm happy to jump in. In fact, I'm just struck by I want to sort of set up the panel a little bit in terms of not attention, but a couple of positions that relate to what's been established already. The question of to know is not enough begs, from my perspective, two sides. One of them is addressed by the notion of translational research and the mediation of research and the implementation of research that sees it going through a translational process. And I'm standing on the other side and arguing for a more immediate and direct access for our students, for those who are facing oppression in the schools. And I'm not trying to be unequivocal about it, but I think it's two sides of this perspective that AERA is wrestling with, that we produce research of very high quality, and the question of getting it out there, getting it beyond just what we know, and maybe that's what it is about, not that knowing is not enough, but that our knowing alone is not enough. And so I'm very interested in how the panel approaches this idea of what does it take. And as I say, we represent a range here.
Well, what I tried to do in my essay, I hope may try to encompass the breadth of questions as well as your point, John. And that is, I think that we have a tendency as researchers in the social sciences to live in these disciplinary silos, and that we assume that what we come to know about some sort of cognitive processes in learning subject matter, what we think we know about schools as organizations, or whatever piece of this complex world of education that we happen to situate ourselves in, that if we can produce knowledge about that piece, that will be sufficient to affect the system. And I think that's one of the fundamental challenges, is that it is a system. And it's a system that involves, in terms of the bigotry questions, it's a system that involves players, all of whom have beliefs and perceptions. And beliefs and perceptions are not always changed simply by access to knowledge. I think that many of us here who are interested both as researchers but also in the practices of our lives and issues of social justice often are situated, are involved in some way around issues of understanding the centrality of culture to what people do. And that's been a long-standing debate, in our field, so that people who think about issues of culture and learning, people who think about the importance of social context, often are situated off as, those are the sort of political people over there, but they don't do basic research that contributes to the, forward flow of knowledge. And then they're the people who do the basic research, as though, again, the world is a complex place in which belief systems and relationships of power and dynamic systems in terms of interacting with each other. I think it's very interesting around some of the issues that I think were raised in this young lady's question, of looking at some of what's happening in the educational policy world today. This is not my field, but just beginning to sort of trace who are the key players, what is the relationship among those key players, what sorts of vested interests do they represent, and the various sectors of the society out of which they come. There's the corporate world, there's the philanthropic world, there's the NGO world, there's the sort of state policy world, and they all have these interesting social networks that promulgate and push ideas forward that then get taken up in interesting kinds of ways. So bottom line, I don't want to go on too long, is just I think that we need a reorientation to trying to understand how systems operate. and all the interacting components and players, etc., in systems. And I don't just mean political systems. I mean psychological systems. I mean whatever the target is. The early childhood target with trying to prepare teachers sits inside of a whole set of perceptions that people bring before they ever come into teacher education, perceptions they have about child development and various pathways or not various pathways. How do they respond to the research that says some kids come prepared because their mothers read to them and they say all these words to them and they come prepared, and then there are the other kids come and their mothers don't have books, so they're not ready to learn, as though school has to be one little boxed up place that if you don't fit the peg, you can't get in. So basically, what I'm arguing for is a need for us to become more ecologically focused, more interdisciplinary in terms of how we try to address the pressing problems of our time.
Thanks for the questions. And, the questions of, like, can educational research incite bigotry and violence certainly makes me think about whether, or the reality, right? That research is always going to arguably incite something, right? It can incite compliance. It can incite violence. It can incite agreement. It can incite passion, right? Research in that sense is always performative, right? It always accomplishes something, even if it's not exactly what we think it was supposed to accomplish. And certainly the question of what counts as knowledge is making me think of three ways that we might think about research and the challenges of producing research that is impactful and engaged. And one is about the regard for research. One is multiple readings of research. And one is about our profession as researchers. And so really briefly, some of my thoughts here are, in terms of the regard for research, I'm thinking about a conversation I was having recently with someone who was talking to policymakers. And he was impressed at how quickly and how easily they would admit that they don't often look at research, right, to inform policies, that sometimes we look for research to back up the policies that we're trying to advocate for, right? And it's not unlike, I think, research that's been going on for decades around teacher preparation, right? And how one of the major challenges of teacher preparation is to get student teachers to change the preconceptions that they have when they enter the program, right? So this is what study after study is kind of telling us, is that we have a problem as teacher educators in terms of challenging and changing those preconceptions, that they're very entrenched. So there's a certain non-use of research, I think, that we need to be thinking about, right? That we're producing all this research, and are we thinking about how it's being picked up, how it's being discussed, how it's being used? And if we're not thinking about that, then are we taking seriously our ethical obligation as researchers, right? Is it just to produce and write stuff, or is it to produce and write stuff that actually is usable and engaged? In terms of readings of research, I'm going back to about how research is always inciting, or at least always inviting something. I think about how there's always multiple ways that we need to acknowledge that there's always multiple ways of reading whatever it is that we produce, right? I think about, for example, one time I was giving a workshop, and it was a workshop on making schools safer for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender students. And I did what a lot of people do when they give workshops like this. I gave a whole bunch of statistics, right? I gave a whole bunch of research. And my thinking was, if people would hear about the extremely high rates of bullying and all the bad things that we know are happening in schools, that they would respond the way that I responded. They would say, well, this is really tragic. I need to act and make schools safer. And one of the students in that workshop, after we walked through all these stats, said, well, I'm kind of curious how people respond when you give a workshop like this, because while it makes me very upset and it makes me want to do things, I can imagine someone going, well, I always thought there was something wrong with being homosexual, and look at all the evidence that all these bad things are happening to them, right? Facts don't always change, as Kara was saying, they don't always change the lenses that we have, right? Sometimes contradictory facts can actually be accommodated in ways that reinforce it. And I think this is something we need to be thinking very seriously about, right? There are always multiple ways of reading. My third point in terms of our profession as researchers gets me thinking about a comment that the late Eric Rofez said in one of his keynote addresses at a conference I once attended, where he said, our profession as academics is a really assimilationist one. And his argument there is that, we value most the kinds of writings that are about talking to ourselves, and we not only don't place a lot of value on things like writing for the newspaper or engaging in community organizing. We actually discourage it, right? So what does it mean to refashion, to really reframe the profession of academics so that it includes things like public intellectual, engaged scholar, community organizer, policy advocate, stuff like that, right? So reframing the profession of researchers. All of these, I think, is these 3 points that I'm trying to make, the regard for research, multiple readings, and the profession, is really about rethinking what it means to be an engaged researcher. And this is what the 4 of us, Teresa, myself, Erica, and Dave, and Bill Ayers, who's unable to be in Vancouver, was trying to write about in our piece, where we're trying to say, well, here's one example. It's not an answer for all of us to follow, but it's an attempt of researchers to try to speak as researchers, to try to see if whatever authority and credibility researchers have can intervene in the debates and the policy conversations. And hopefully my colleagues can help to flesh some of those challenges as well as some of those learnings out. But that is how I see us trying to speak back to some of these questions.
Again, my apologies for my tardiness, everybody. There's a run in the sun, or sun run that I got caught into in a little traffic jam. But the context, and I want to really flush out what Kevin was talking about in terms of these multiple readings, because as the earlier point was made around this utilitarian nature of research and this notion around how can you actually push that forward, understanding the particular context that communities are facing. So again, if we look at places like Chicago, Miami, New Orleans, New York City, Los Angeles, and you see the particular machinations around what's being ascribed for families as quality education, and we see this disconnect between what's purported as quality education and what's actually happening on the ground, then what is this way by which to communicate this to the affected, right? So what are the ways by which we can communicate this disconnect to communities that are seeing this on the ground, and then asking another question, challenging us to think about for what? So for what purpose? Is it just us making this commentary in a public offering like a newspaper? Is it us actually engaging policy folks in terms of pushing legislation that will halt some of these particular issues? Or is it actually teaming with community folks at the school level talking about their particular issues and concerns? And in CREATE, that was the idea, because these things are being purported on communities that are actually working towards their detriment. And I'll give you all one quick example. This past February, Chicago Public Schools decided to close 17 schools. This closing of those 17 schools will make 101 closings in the last 6 years. But there's one school in that particular group of 17 that brings forward a number of questions and concerns. And the school is called Casals Elementary. Casals was closed for what they called chronic underperformance and what they call underutilization, which means you don't have enough students in the building. Now, if we look at Casals from a different angle, Casals was scoring higher than 60% of the magnet schools in the city. Casals was scoring, their reading scores were at the 75th percentile. But they were closed not because of chronic underperformance or underpopulation, underutilization, because we actually looked at the data and demonstrated that they were not underutilized, but in fact, they were beyond the threshold of what they call underutilization. But another thing that happens in this place, Casals Elementary is in a place called Humboldt Park. Humboldt Park is experiencing extreme gentrification, and Casals is right in the middle of this new development. So it's not about so much this underutilization, but it's about actually accessing that particular school for the new gentry of families that will come into that place. But again, how do we actually begin to articulate this to larger communities for the purpose of halting that reality? So what happened so there's a court case filed. And in that court case, those 17 schools are the plaintiffs, and they're actually pushing for not just keeping Casals open, but the other schools that have very questionable or dubious claims around their underutilization and chronic underperformance. So again, how do we begin to look at these contexts and start to address them in a way that puts the research not necessarily in the forefront, but supporting the realities that we're actually seeing on the ground? So again, pushing us to understand that paradigm a little differently, in opposed to us coming in as researchers as those who have knowledge or who are knowing. But how do we become informed by those contexts and push those forward to support the issues of the affected who are trying to demand quality education?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out at 8:15 in the morning. I'm Erica Miners, and I'll just add a little bit based on the essay that we wrote, the folks in Chicago, and just kind of following our conversation this morning. So that one of the things that we've been thinking about is sort of how to change notions of professionalism and what kinds of skills the teachers that we work with in teacher training programs, the graduate students that we work with need. When we look at the landscape of urban education, when we look at the landscape of K through 16 education, what kinds of skill sets do folks need? In part, of course, that's research skills, to be a good scholar, but also folks need skills in community organizing. Folks need skills in reading legislative policies and engaging. Folks need skills in coalition building. Folks are interested in how do we write press releases, how do we mobilize. And so I think that we, through this establishment of a collective CREATE, have been trying to develop those skills for ourselves, but also then model that skill acquisition for both our graduate students and our teachers. So we have both been inspired by the Chicago Teachers Union. A progressive caucus took over the Chicago Teachers Union a couple of years ago and has really been fighting for high-quality, accessible public education for all. And watching the struggles that they've engaged in, I think really motivated a lot of us to say, hey, what are we doing? How can we contribute? How are we participating? So I've been thinking and really thinking about how can we distribute access to those skills and those models of collectivizing for our graduate students and for folks in teacher ed programs, because that's what I see as really needed right now in public ed. People need research skills, but also need community organizing skills, need abilities to work in coalitions, need more community organizing.
Hi, I'm Teresa Quinn. One of the great things about working on a project with so many other people is that by the time the mic gets to you, you don't really have to add too much. So I'm only going to add a couple things. I agree with the things that all my collaborators here said. And I also just wanted to add that one of the really wonderful things about working on this project with so many other folks, in addition to the fact that they've said brilliant things and I can follow them, is that it was a collaborative project, and we were able to think collaboratively about ways to use our research as a tool to actually make the kinds of changes, or at least move down the road towards making the changes that we really thought needed to be made in the city of Chicago. So while Erica and Kevin and Dave are talking about the kinds of things that K-12 teachers need, needing to be organizers, need to know how to read policy. We also had to educate ourselves about those things and draw on our own backgrounds as activists in our own communities to take the tools. Now we're all in these academies using research as a tool. How can we then take that tool of research and actually see some change happen in our lifetime? We didn't want our articles just to sit on a shelf in a library, or maybe if we're lucky get used in a classroom somewhere. We actually wanted to see some changes happen on the ground. And so I think that kind of energy really motivated us to not wait until we already felt like we knew all the answers, and to not wait for permission from someone to take some action, and also to try multiple strategies. We were not adverse to using petition as well as getting a publication out there. So anyway, I would just add that as thinking of research as a tool and thinking of collaboration as a really wonderful way to use that tool.
Thank you. Thanks for your frames on the theme. I think that was very helpful, and I'm hearing the need for us as an educational research community to really rethink the way we do business, if you will. And it's not business as usual.
Could I add one comment?
Yes, please.
I thought about it in terms of the example that Dave had given. I want to try to connect it in what I think and hope are complementary ways. That I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. I have been engaged in political activism since some of you were born. But even that work, I think, that we do as researchers can have a qualitative difference if we are informed by research that helps us understand the nature of the problem that we're addressing. So the problem of school reform, as it has been taken up largely in the public, and I would argue reinforced to a large degree in many ways as researchers, on the assumption that some simple process of reorganizing schools, because there's also the consortium report that says all these years they've closed out all these 100 schools, right, that I think they've gotten on average, a month in reading and 2 months in math growth for kids, you know, and different kids end up in the building than were there before. But that's not the problem. The problem space, if we're just using Chicago as an example, has to do with understanding, as you have said, for example, patterns of gentrification. It has to do with understanding who are the players who are informing these policies, who are typically people that the public doesn't see. Yes. They don't know who these people are. Mm-hmm. And the ways in which those relationships are political and economic and personal and social, and understanding that as a system in a, let's say, in a district, for example, which has become replicated in interesting ways at the national level, but just as a system, is, I think, gives you multiple pathways. And sometimes it's the multiplicative effect of the kind of public work that you guys have been describing on the one hand, with other things that may be going on that the public and nobody else sees, but has to do with what you understand about political contingencies between particular kinds of players, that if you can impact that, you get a very different, sort of public response. But all I'm saying is I do believe that this kind of dual role of activist scholar can be informed if we either have access to research or ourselves conduct research that really tries to get at understanding the complexity of the systems that are going to influence decisions in education, as opposed to assuming that they're merely structural, merely structural issues that inform these decisions. Typically don't have anything to do with that. Because even in that case, the consortium is putting out all this research. This recent report they've had around the ineffectiveness of the turnaround model has had absolutely no impact. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe, and personally, I don't believe if you translated it and put it in an article and passed it out, that it would still make a difference, because the people who are making decisions, they're not going to be influenced by it, because they know that already, that that's not what it's not about, changing outcomes. It's about creating other kinds of political pathways for other people. That's the point of it, right?
Thank you. Questions, comments, challenges? We'd like to hear from you. Who has a thought that they would like to share? Just let me know, and I'll bring a mic over to you.
I was thinking about the fact that you mentioned about being interdisciplinary, and oftentimes in higher ed, to collaborate across departments or across disciplines can be very impactful, and also utilizing that in connections with working within the communities. Do you feel that if universities across departments or disciplines worked more collaboratively on particular research that deals with issues that a particular community is facing, and they are more entrenched into the inner workings of the underlying issues that might not be well known publicly, would that make more of an impact in making a difference in the lives of children and communities?
I think it has the opportunity to change the frame. And I think, but again, I am extremely skeptical of the role of universities in collaboration with communities around who determines what that relationship looks like. And it has to be you have to be very clear around what that space looks like, and then in the disciplines, under what auspices do you actually engage that type of work? You know, if it is collaborative work, how's that collaborative work defined? If it's interdisciplinary work, how is that work defined so that you have more egalitarian space in opposed to this more competitive space around who's going to sit here in the panel on the ARA and then talk about it and then write the funky book that somebody has to buy for their classes, right? So this thing around, and I always state that because I'm trying to push myself around challenging that traditional colonial paradigm, right? And what does it actually mean to access these resources to build across spaces? And I think some folks who have done a pretty good job around this in terms of actually engaging collaborative projects. There's, at the University of Illinois, there's the Labor Center. And with the Labor Center, they just produced a report, a very interesting report on teacher work. And in this explanation, what it does is it changes the frame for this idea around the lazy teacher, because it actually breaks down what a teacher does in the workday. And in that explanation, what they've done, they've put together, so my colleagues here, folks who are in labor and industrial relationships, people who are in urban planning, other folks who are in political science, have all contributed to this report. But what this actually has done is now being issued as a way to change the framing of teaching. So if we talk about quality education includes the support of teachers, right? So again, changing that frame, but I'm, again, being very clear about what mitigates how you engage, or under what terms will communities be engaged. Because I think a lot of times we re-up, and Linda Tui-Y-Smith always reminds us around this, we are very quick to re-up that colonial project and claim and have our little parade of folks that we do work with and maybe present with or what have you. But again, asking that deeper question around what happens on the ground. And then if we look at that longitudinally, what kind of questions do we ask in terms of whether or not this work was effective, and how are the affected responding, and what's the things that are actually happening to them? So again, I always think about, I appreciate that question because that's something I'm constantly trying to push myself around.
I also want to respond. I mean, you're making me think of not only the importance of collectivizing as a profession, but also kind of consolidating different sectors, as Erica talks about a lot, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, we need to be organized not only as researchers, but we also need to see multiple ways of bringing researchers together with other constituents, right? How often are researchers working collectively with the unions? How often are the researchers working collectively with the parent groups? In Chicago, for example, the parent groups, over 24 groups recently issued this wonderful research brief on what was it on the longer school day, right? Right. So the mayor is like, Chicago needs to lengthen the school day, and the parent group said, it's not just about the length of the day. It's also, we need to be thinking about how we actually spend that time. And so they issued this brief, and I think that anyway, collectivizing and bringing different groups are really important as we think about how to reframe the debate. And as I think what Dave is thinking about is our challenge is not just to get out the research, but also to offer people different metaphors or frameworks for talking about these issues, right? In other words, is it just about debating whether the day should be 6.5 or 7.5, or is it about reframing the debate to get us thinking about how it's not only the quantity of time, but also the quality of time, right? Or same with teacher eval. Is the debate about whether test scores should count as 5% or 40% of teacher evaluation, or is the debate about something much bigger and much deeper and much more complex? One thing that we're seeing happening around the country is researchers beginning to get organized and speaking out. And, in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, almost 100 professors signed a letter about teacher evaluation, right, to say the use of value-added models to constitute this big percentage of teacher evaluation that has high stakes attached to it is really problematic, and here's why. And it's built actually off of the model that some of you are familiar with, the letter, not the model, but the letter that over 1,400 principals in New York State signed. After our professor letter, then a joint letter by professors in New York State was issued to the Board of Regents, an open letter. And there's organizing in at least 2 other states going on, which is a good thing because of ALEC, right? This legislation is spreading all over the country. So I think as we think about how to speak out, we should also think about what can we build institutionally to support researchers in doing this kind of collectivizing. In other words, does AERA have a role to play, for example, in supporting researchers in collectivizing and speaking out? I think these are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves as a profession.
We have a
Vic,
couple
I could just add on to that. AERA sent a similar letter out with other associations over a year ago on the value-added testing stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to keep saying, it didn't matter, right? It's not like they don't know, right? The methodologists, NCME, they've issued a statement. AERA has issued a statement on this value-added testing, evaluation of teachers. And for me, this gets at part of the question of the theme that our NEAP has set. It is not the case that the key players involved are unaware that there are counter-arguments, right? Now, I think there's another set of issues as to how do we help the public understand this in ways that public on-the-ground political organizing can begin to push it. But that pushing isn't going to be about knowledge. That pushing is going to be about, it's going to be about political organizing and pressure to get people to move off of positions that reflect their own vested self-interest.
Thank you.
I don't know if that actually is speaking against what I just said, though. I mean, I feel like...
I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. All I'm saying is that it is not a sufficient response because the problem is not that those who are involved, for example, in pushing this legislation are not aware of the research that doesn't support it.
Right. And I think, so I would agree, right? Because I think, our strategy was as much around speaking to the policymakers as it was about trying to engage a broader public debate, right? So if the letter is only speaking to policymakers, I would agree. Clear, they probably do know these arguments. But are we enabling, for example, the public conversation, other constituents, to pick up these ideas and to try to reframe that debate?
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important.
Thank you. I'd like to get a couple of questions from the audience in. Thanks.
There are some people over there that had to answer, too.
Just listening to your teacher evaluation and turnaround things in which you said that basically the research was ignored, and I think you're probably absolutely correct that that is in fact the case. And you've talked about public involvement, and I think that's very important. But what happens is that the policy level, and what you had mentioned, that happens that nobody ever sees, happens in state houses for the most part. And when you have Chicago, you've got a central bureaucracy there, which is invisible. I'm a member of State Board of Education, and let me tell you how much Fordham sends me. Quite a bit. And they are very effective, and all the other conservative think tanks and ideological think tanks, they're incredibly effective in getting the message to policymakers. And that's where I think the game has to be played. And so I ask you folks to, I think this is more of a comment than a remark, than a question rather, is how do we get to these people? I think it is imperative that you do get to the people who make the actual decisions. And that's the most important piece there.
Comments?
Maybe I'll just make a question or make a comment about sort of social movement analysis, because I think that's what a lot of us on the panel are talking about. How do we make structural change? How do we make systems change? How do we build sustainable social movements? And I don't think that there's like one pathway or one right way. I think we definitely need to, call out bad social science research and put, whether it's on the school day, whether it's on zero tolerance policies, we need to get that into the public sphere. But one of the benefits of some of the collective projects that we've been involved in is lateral political education and sort of building communities of struggle for the long haul. And I think that that as a goal for social movements is really important. When we look at lives within universities, they're very siloed, right? We don't see ourselves as political actors often. We don't see ourselves as working in communities for change, and I'm generalizing here because I know most of the people on this panel sort of see themselves that way, but I think that when we're professionalized to be faculty members, that's not the work that we see ourselves as doing. So I think that one of the powerful byproducts of some of the small initiatives that we've started is sort of that collectivizing to do lateral political education, to think about how do we get community organizing skills, how do we get labor analysis skills, how do we use those? And so I'm suggesting that's one piece of developing strong social movements. It's not going to be a recipe A, B plus C equals, systems change, structural change. But I think that's a really important part for me, is building these kind of communities, building collective structures that involve lateral political education. Because I think that we don't know what our colleagues in AFAM studies are doing. We don't know what our colleagues in geography are doing. And I think it's sort of key to be able to try to work against the structures of universities that are about isolation, I think, and very individualistic work.
If I can jump in with not a contrary position, but another position, Erica.
Okay.
In terms of social movements, I'm arguing and did in my piece that there was something more basic that we needed to consider, and that was just making our work available.
Yeah.
And so the ideas we've been hearing about, particularly around the Chicago area, all of those might be valuable elsewhere. And that the division between the social movement and the social activism that we do in communities and then the work we do in the university, as if that was somehow separate and we send that off to get published. I think we need to credit social organizations on the ground in terms of their ability to take up the research, to be inspired or incited or invited. I love to think that every piece of research incites something, but that hasn't been the case always. But this idea then that we have something basic and necessary to start with, and that is that our work is public from the get-go, whatever its position. And is it open to misinterpretation? Yes. And does it contribute to the democratic deliberation? Well, I would hope so. And so this idea then that we would start with that premise that our work is public, and that what we do locally might have an impact, and that we don't think for a moment, or at least we don't rule out the possibility that others can take up our work without translation, without our particular involvement, and that they can be trusted to run with the knowledge.
I'll just add to that. I love what John's saying, and one of the things that we've done in our collective Create is that we've been heavily using social media. So all our policy briefs are distributed online, and we've tweeted them out, and we've tried to make them available through press conferences and just widely. And they're written, we hope, in a really accessible way so that they're useful for the people who we're distributing them to.
I have another question. Is that all right?
Yeah.
First of all, go Flyers. So I'm from Philadelphia, and I'm going to hide my name tag so you don't know where I'm from in Philadelphia, because a couple of things that you said have been resonating for me in that there are many, many universities that surround and are seated in Philadelphia, but my own personal experience at the university is that there's this tightening in terms of the perceptions of our job as a business, that we're a business, that we're providing education for future teachers, and we have to think of it as a business. And my provost actually said when I took a program that had to do with bringing different kinds of students on campus, they were students with disabilities specifically, and he turned down our proposal saying it was a cost neutral. So we had money coming in to support the students, and he said, we're not in the business of doing programs that don't make money for the university. And I was quite shocked, and later that day he made a speech about how universities are about the public good. And so I'm feeling like there's this contrast, and I think the economic environment right now has, you're talking about our role as university folks and this actual active pressure that we're under to abandon or to reinterpret, away from this idea of common good to the good of our institution and our own students. So that weird feeling of going to Philadelphia to get what we need to provide for our teachers an urban experience, as opposed to, even though everyone in our department has a very strong social justice, passion, there's still that discomfort with that overall sense of pressure. I just want to, all of you being academics as well, if you've experienced or your insights on those pressures.
Yeah, welcome to the new day. I mean, not necessarily a new day, right? So if we read folks like David Harvey, he traces this back to Carter, right? And this thing around understanding the neoliberal university. So our colleague Sharon Haar actually does all this work around what she calls a neoliberal university. But in things of understanding these markets, and this is where, and I like the fact that you've identified that conundrum, but this is where we have to make a decision, right? Are we bound to the travails of the university, or are we going to do what we need to do despite whatever consequences, right? Because if we're talking about justice, we're going to have to think about what that justice means longitudinally, right? So this larger justice project will mean sometimes that you're going to be immersed in that tension. And going back to Erica's point, the key in understanding that you're going to be immersed in that tension is collectivizing, right? Always talk about it in terms of teacher ed, right? The easiest thing to do to you as a teacher to get you out of the profession is to isolate you, right? The way that you prevent isolation is your ability to actually work with others based on these issues and concerns. So if the provost, if the provost said that you can't bring those young folks to the building, well, you have a program day and you bring them anyway, right? Right, exactly. So this whole notion around understanding, and going back to Carol's earlier point around understanding the context. So if I'm understanding what's happening in Philly, I can't have that conversation without understanding the travails of Paul Vallis, right? So Vallis leaves Chicago, loses his run for governor, goes to Philly, then goes to New Orleans, and has essentially just botched both situations. But then, in terms of understanding systems, where does Paul Vallis go after New Orleans? Haiti and earthquake just happened in South America, not Peru, but where the miners were trapped. Chile. Right? So Vallis goes from to Haiti to Chile, right? And then that understanding of disaster capitalism around, and that goes right back to the IMF in terms of understanding what are the first programs around structural relief. It's always education, right? So understanding that context and what does it actually, and I'm going back to Carol's challenge, what does it actually mean for teachers to understand that context, right? That you're operating in this space where folks who are making the decisions around education know nothing about it, right? And then how do you actually start to move in ways that collectivize and galvanize political power to change that frame and the reality? So again, looking in that, and always thinking about the situation, never about if, but when. Because once you've made a decision to side with justice, that's when that hammer is coming. And it is coming, right, in all its different ways. But in the same time, not being fearful of that, but understanding that that's the context and moving forward and the responsibility of collectivizing in that.
I also wanted to say that I think there's something interesting about this moment for academics. Or there's a potential in this moment as we see the effects of privatization on our, hopefully most of the time, somewhat still public kinds of universities. And that is that we can see ourselves more in alignment with the other workers in our institutions and actually just more broadly with workers in general. So I work at a private institution. It's the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. And a couple of years ago, I organized a session on unionizing. So because of the yeshiva ruling at private colleges, full-time faculty are not really allowed to, or we're not able to organize, but the part-timers can. So we had this great session. We had folks like Jeffrey Williams and Mark Bousquet who have been writing really interesting stuff about labor in the academy. And we had a handful of people show up. It was just incredible to me. These wonderful folks speaking for free, 3 people in the room. And so I talked to one of the faculty members who didn't show about, and her department actually funded the thing. And she said, well, I'm really not, I'm not a worker, I'm a professor. And I thought, well, this is so symptomatic of the way, our problem is academics. And it's part of the reason that it's this way, right? We're full-time people. We don't feel aligned with the part-time people. Well, frankly, most of our public universities are propped up on the labor of part-time people. So we should already be involved in organizing. And it's been disaster capitalism in terms of labor broadly in the U.S., since forever. So it's no different in that way, I think, than other things that are happening to other laborers. I just think there's like a potential in this moment that maybe we can form some coalitions with other workers out there and try to bring back some kind of representation for labor, actually.
Have another question?
Good morning. I'm Carol Cara from the Chicago Teachers Union, and I apologize for getting here late, so if I repeat something that was said, but I'm sorry. But I wanted to answer some of these questions from a little different point of view. I am an academic. I head the research department at the Chicago Teachers Union. That in and of itself is kind of a big deal. I mean, it's not something that unions typically do, but when our new administration came in, we felt like that was an important emphasis, and it's been extremely valuable to have this group create in the area. It's like a really it's a situation where you have a very active teachers union that is promoting research-based policies, and then you have an active group of academics, and you have an active group of parents. So it's a situation where we can really move things, and where these different aspects come together. The union published a report. Did you already talk about that? No. Okay, so the union published a report, which I'm going to promote. I have a little flyer about it, and you can get it on our website. But it's called "The Schools Chicago Students Deserve," and many of the people on the panel were very helpful at giving feedback to this report. And the idea of the report is to have a counter narrative promoted by the Chicago Teachers Union against all the neoliberal. Let me think of a polite word. Junk that is coming out, in the name of education reform, and so this is an opportunity where the research that maybe some of you are involved in or whatever has been promoted in this pamphlet as look, instead of just doing these projects that the Gates Foundation wants, or other people that are running the society want to promote for their own business interests. Let's promote actual research-based education policy, like smaller class size, other things that you're all familiar with. That is actually what we need, and so. By bringing together, the academic and then the political, harnessing the power of our members by giving them this information and giving the public this information, I think it's been really helpful. The report that Dave Stovall mentioned about the number of hours that teachers work. That's really helpful to us because we're in negotiations, over our contract, and so that has a specific impact on what we can say publicly about that. That they want to say we're overpaid, and we can counter with this research, and so it's been really, really helpful to us. And I think obviously, as people have said, research doesn't stand by itself alone. But neither does activism stand alone without the research base to actually promote ideas that are going to be worthwhile for improving education. So I salute the work of the academics here, and thank you.
Comments?
Good to see you, Carol.
Hi there. I'm actually an assistant superintendent in a school division in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So this might be one of my questions, and it's been a question I've had for a very long time. As researchers, what do you see as your responsibility to teachers, principals, superintendents, and schools, those of us that the great divide of the theorists and the practitioners, and as if there's two separate things? What do you also see as your relationship to those of us in schools? Or I can put it another way, as researchers, what can the field, those of us, count on you for?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, because that's the type of things that we don't ask very, very frequently. And I think in terms of looking at what is the responsibility of researchers who have actually engaged in this justice project, is to work in solidarity with folks who are on the ground. And one of the things that I often think about in terms of working in solidarity with folks, in terms of engaging that process and actually before we come to each other with what it is that we're going to do, because that's often a tension, especially in terms of school space, right? There's this tension in terms of I run this schoolhouse, and then I know this thing as a researcher, and I've been, and this is where we also have to confront, because when you all hire consultants, the question is always, who are these people, right? And what do they have, and what do they plan to do in terms of work that is addressing the issues and concerns that you have identified? And will you actually engage that type of work that could potentially challenge what you currently do in Winnipeg? And then in that challenge, is there a way that you design collectively what you have the researchers engage, what you will engage, and then meet at the end and talk about the results? But I think this is the tension. Not in terms, because what I think we see a divide in what is asked of us by state, local, and federal bodies, and what has been identified as what's needed on the ground by families, students, and teachers. And I think those pieces have to be bridged. And I think as somebody who's employed as a researcher and has these particular skills, my job is to engage that space from a point of solidarity, which means that there are points that we may disagree, but the main purpose and the purpose that we have to agree on and that we're always reflecting upon is how are the affected engaged in this process. And I think this becomes, so as the work of folks in CREATE, this thing around being accountable, because that's another thing that we don't have as academics, right? We can just fly around the world and come to different conferences and say whatever we want. But what is this thing around accountability to those places in which we work? So what accounts for accountability in community space? What accounts for accountability if you're actually going to engage that district space? And then for the district, what's that question when we identify, like Carol said earlier, what's going to happen when we identify those players and ask you that question? Okay, you're still going to have that lifetime contract with Pearson for $700 million, right? Are you actually going to engage these particular communities where you have folks who are being pushed out and rationalized as to why this push out is happening? And to what extent will the district and the researcher challenge themselves to address the issues on the ground? Because I think too many times we get so encapsulated in what the state is asking of us, but there's never any pushback in terms of whether or not this is affected, right? So again, always think about that in terms of solidarity, and then actually working in concert with folks, but also agreeing to disagree, and then hash out that disagreement and still do that work on the ground. And I'll end with this thing. One of the things that I've been doing as of late, because I always, we rag so hard on teachers, something that I've been doing over the last couple of years is teaching a high school social studies class, right? So it's not this whole thing, so I can't just be running my mouth, right? So this thing, what does it actually mean to grind first period, right? And get there 2 hours before class to get yourself together, and then be there when, young folks are explaining their particular situation. So challenging myself around those particular issues, because I think in research space, I think there's been this conundrum around, we talk about stuff that we don't know, of which we know very little, right? Especially in something like teacher education that's highly regulated now, right? In terms of what constitutes a quote unquote quality teacher, right? I mean, I'm starting to fear we're going to have days where they're testing on how folks go to the bathroom, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. But at the same time, how do we push back on that, and in what ways do we engage that?
I just wanted to also offer that I think this question of what are our responsibilities as researchers is one that I'm definitely finding myself trying to grapple with more and more in recent times. And so three thoughts come to mind for me about, three areas come to mind. One is around research questions, and one is around the research products, and one is around our joint actions. And so I kind of feel like on the first point, I'm more and more driven to see my responsibility as a researcher as one that involves coming up with research questions that are responsive. So when CREATE, for example, was trying to figure out what joint research projects we would launch, and in this academic year, we're probably releasing 5 public statements or research briefs, and they were decided upon in conversation with folks like teachers groups and parents groups. And even the latest book, some of my friends will tell you, I was actually planning to write an entirely different book last summer. And after all the public mobilizations that were going around regarding the attacks on the public sector, it changed my priorities. And I ended up writing an entirely different book than I thought I was going to. But I think that's one thing that we should be thinking about is, when I was in grad school and we were in this pro seminar and all the professors, how those of you who might have had a grad school experience similar to mine, you have a pro seminar where every week a different professor comes to your seminar, and they're like, let me tell you about my research. And we would often ask the professors, so why are you doing this research? Like, what's the reason for this topic and these questions? And a lot of them would say things like, well, I feel like it's a luxury to be able to ask whatever, to explore the questions that I'm interested in exploring. And very few of them would actually say, well, it's generated for this reason, in conversations with these groups, in response to these needs. And I think that's one thing we should push ourselves on, is to come up with questions that are more responsive. I think my second thing is about the research products. I think our responsibility as researchers is to come up with products that are usable. And how we define usable, I think, is open for debate, right? There's usefulness in research products that are very theoretical and dense, right? Not everything should be quote-unquote transparent. Not everything should be directly related to policy. There's different purposes for different kinds of products, but I think that's something that we should be very conscientious and critical about, is, well, what are the different kinds of products that we could be producing? The same study can result in an AERJ article, right, and an op-ed article and a public event for the community. So we can have multiple audiences. We can engage in different kinds of conversations, and that's one thing that I would urge us to think about. And then my third thought is around joint actions. And I think I can see Erica's notes, so I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about this, but not to steal her thunder. But I feel like researchers need to be very intentional about getting outside of the academy and about using whatever credibility we have to kind of push back on public conversations, and whether that means collaborating with orgs, speaking at public events, writing for the popular press, all of that, I think in collaboration with other orgs is what I'm trying to say, is one thing that I would urge us to be very intentional about as well. I see that as very much our responsibility, and that is to bring our work to bear on social needs.
I'll just make a couple of quick points. One is just echoing the idea for me of moving away from sort of a research of convenience to sort of research that emerges from collective needs. And then the second point, I want to make sort of some sub-points about the question. I work with a lot of smaller community-based organizations across the city of Chicago, and this might be super material, but doing things like my commitment is always leveraging resources, wealth redistribution. I work at a public university that has access to space, money, photocopying. I think wealth redistribution is important. I think showing up at community-based organization events, showing up for things that isn't about your work is really key. I think that, as Dave was saying earlier, agreeing to disagree and not romanticizing work on either end is really important, and it's a commitment we make. Also, having a long-term commitment to organizations. So if you're going to come and do work, you're making a long-term commitment. I think key. And then I think where you started about the not dichotomizing who's the knowledge producer, who gets to be the expert, really, and not minimizing the skills that different people come to the table with, but being really clear that that the knowledge doesn't just come from the institution or people with degrees.
Any other comments?
Yeah,
We've got a couple of other questions. We'll get around there. John?
Okay, I just encourage, going back to the role of the superintendent, the reaching out to the university. And that can be both to make demands, to say, where is the local university, University of Winnipeg or University of Manitoba, but to encourage that sense that the school district itself is willing and interested, and that helping with access, and providing a way in which the teachers and the administration, the bureaucracy of the school itself, the school system, the school district, sees itself as engaged in that community of creating a collective in the spirit that's been addressed here. Because I know a number of us probably are former school teachers, and we have felt in the sense that we've crossed that divide and we're no longer as welcome as we once were, particularly at the superintendency level. And so I think that that kind of reaching out that you're providing, and similarly with the teacher unions and teacher associations, I think it goes both ways, and it doesn't fall entirely onto us to make that bridge.
Yeah. I just feel that sometimes when one says one's an assistant superintendent, it means so many different things for you guys in the States than it does in my context.
Actually, I'm a Canadian.
I actually know that. I met with Kieran Egan just a couple of days ago.
Good call again.
I'm a teacher first, and actually that's how I continue to approach all of my work so that I don't get sucked into a bureaucracy. And so we do engage with the professors in our community in collaborative work, all kinds of things that we do. But I think part of it is that I think we still have to come back to what the purposes of education are and what it means to educate, and have those questions first and foremost in all of the work that all of us do. Because if it isn't making a difference for the children in our communities and their families, then I have to ask myself, what is it about? And so that's part of my question, that absolutely we both have responsibility to engage one another in different kinds of ways, for sure. And I'm looking for a relationship where we're not instruments of one another, but we really are involved in a collective work to improve the lives of kids and their families. So I just thought I better say that because I'm not a bad person as a superintendent.
No, I didn't mean to imply that. Some of my best friends are superintendents.
We ready for another question?
Sure. Thank you. I'm Miriam Torres. I'm in New Mexico State University. And I attended last year a conference called by the California Faculty Association. And they created kind of a movement in higher education, a movement to countering the conservative agenda that goes all the way against education in general, and in this case, particularly in higher education. And we have heard the politicians saying that those that go to college are snobbies. And that is, we are very aware that the conservative agenda is well-funded, well-publicized, and they're very active, and they have people of theirs, like the Business Roundtable in every state and even in every district, school district and university, they are all over there. So I entered this, I'm sorry I came late, listening to the issues of movements, social movements, and that is precisely where this organization that is called Campaign for the Future of Higher Education. And they are organized in terms of having think tanks to counteract, thinking about how strategizing, how can we respond and counteract the conservative agenda and, of course, the neoliberalism, which is part of the conservative agenda. And I would say one of our issues is this separation between who does the research and who does to apply that. And I see in the growing of here in ARA the presentation of students and also faculty in this new approach to research, which is relatively new approach to this participatory action research, where the participants and the researchers are together to search for knowledge and also use that knowledge for the benefit of the community and for the benefit of the whole system, I would say. So this is really very important for me to start really talking seriously or organizing as a movement to counteract. Otherwise, we are going to be that's what I'm thinking. I've seen in the last 2 decades is a very fast growing kind of foundations, research centers that are eating up all the progressive achievement that has been really obtained in the 70s and the 80s, actually in the 70s. So it's up to us, and that's my interest in this session. I wanted to hear that we are in this mood to integrate, and I like the title of this, the theme of this conference, which is to know is not enough. And so what is not enough? That really to not need to be with action or without any separation of the people and of the project. All are together. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments?
Well, I think it's important, the point that you made of recognizing that there are, political communities on the left and the right who are both involved in on-the-ground organizing. And in many respects, in the United States at least, the conservative wing that includes collaborations of researchers, NGOs, philanthropic organizations are very organized in ways that I think on the left we're not. There's also, I think, this notion of collaborative research and sort of crossing boundaries. One powerful example, so the brother from San Francisco State.
Jeffrey Duncan Andrade.
Yeah, Jeff Duncan Andrade for the last about 4 years has brought, he's the kind of scholar that you're talking about, and to some degree I think that the superintendent was talking about, who he teaches at San Francisco State, but he also works in a community-based school, similar to what Dave does. I do the same thing in Chicago. And these young people, high school students, are working on questions that are situated in their own lives, the political circumstances of their own lives, and they conduct original research, and they come to AERA and they make presentations. I think the first or second year they came, at that point I was vice president of Division G, so we helped financially support them, and they came and presented to the Division G, which is the second largest division in AER. So they had a big audience, and they were just highly impressive. They were asking us questions, and but I think that's a very interesting model. There's also, some years ago, even before Jeff started doing his work, the Algebra Project with Bob Moses. And one of the most powerful presentations I've ever seen at AERA, Bob brought some students from the Algebra Project at this high school they were working with in Jackson, Mississippi. And these young men were talking about, in the high school where they were, that the teacher who taught freshman algebra, because in the Algebra Project, the argument is that mathematical literacy is the civil right of the 21st century. And And it represents a very different kind of research model, I think, that's very complementary to what we're talking about, in the sense that it's connecting research communities and young people as being actively engaged, and connecting the learning, in this case of disciplinary content, with understanding its usage in navigating issues of power in their own communities, including their own schools. So they found out that the freshman teacher, algebra teacher, was pregnant and was going to go on maternity leave by the middle of the year. And they said they knew that whoever the substitute was not going to be any good. So they decided that they were going to teach the class. These young men were juniors and seniors and who had been in the algebra project for years. And they went in and they taught the class. And the substitute was there as an adult because you had to have, somebody. And they talked about it. It was just extraordinary. So I think that's also another interesting way in which some of this boundary crossing can take place. And I just wanted to throw these out as some interesting examples that I've certainly seen in the context of AERA. And also, although I don't think it's connected in the same way, but AERA has also had an initiative the last few years of inviting undergraduates to come to AERA. I don't think it's been attached to any social justice training, if you will, but I do think it's a kind of sort of reaching out to expand the boundaries of who this community of AERA is.
Thank you. We have another comment?
Quick comment. Also, if you haven't read it yet, Lessons from Finland by Pasi Sahlberg is an excellent book. And one of the things that Finland did 30 years ago was they reorganized their teacher education programs so that they are all research-based. And entry level for teaching there starts with a master's degree, and the degree is a research degree. So teachers are doing original research. They're using then that research to shape what goes on in their schools. And it's been fantastically successful there. And the book is really excellent. It talks a lot about that project.
I think that one of the interesting things I've been thinking about from the very first question this morning is that the efforts in which we are engaged in the United States that are most prevalent around trying to improve education bear no relationship whatsoever to what other high-achieving nations do. Mm-hmm. Absolutely none. That's why I say it's a question. It's not like this is a knowledge question, or like we don't really know how to do that. We don't know how to transform schools. Well, we do. That's not the issue. Mm-hmm. And so you have this model in Finland, the master's degree, the state pays for the master's degree, mm-hmm. and you have to be highly competitive as an undergraduate to be eligible to go into this highly valued field of teaching. Teachers make what doctors and lawyers make, although doctors and lawyers in Finland don't make what doctors and lawyers make in the United States, but that's another interesting question, right? Same thing in Japan. I was in China about a year or so ago. We were visiting a school in a small rural district, and these teachers are talking about the research that informed, and this wasn't in Beijing or Shanghai. This was some little, rural town, and these teachers were talking about the research that they were doing on their practice and what they were learning. So it's just, I think it's a fundamental question to try to understand the factors that influence how we try to address the problems and inequalities in education in the United States. And I would still argue that it is not a question of logic, and it is not a question of whether do we have a sufficient research base in order to be able to teach all kids well. I don't even think that's the issue at all. I think it's a whole different set of issues that really have to do with understanding how political systems operate and how do you get in and begin to influence. And I think work on the history of social justice movements can be very informative because it's a different. It's trying to impact the system, the political and economic system in which these decisions are made. But it is not the case that the decisions that we're making in school districts or schools of education or wherever they are, whatever they are, that we don't have a knowledge base. We act like this is something like You know, like it's rocket science to do. It's not.
Just a quick, that reminds me that educational, like anti-poverty work is educational justice work. Working against mass incarceration in the United States is educational justice work. Immigration justice work is educational justice work. LGBTQ liberation work is educational justice work. So the ways in which our institutions and our professional lives are siloed is reflected in our organizing movement. So I think it's really important to see ourselves as like cultural workers, building coalitions across those so we can say, hey, the fight for a minimum wage that's a living wage or a flourishing wage is an educational justice issue, and make those connections for our teachers, for our colleagues, and for ourselves. I think that's a really important work in this moment.
We have just about 5 minutes left. I have another question over here.
Thank you. My name is Beverly Brown, and I'm with the State Department of Education in Michigan, so I'm a neighbor. I've recently begun working with them just for about 3 months now in the School Reform and Redesign Office. And so as a researcher, I'm really delighted to be able to use my knowledge with the lowest 5% of the persistently lowest achieving schools in the state now. It is challenging work, make no mistake. It is hard work. My question to you is, what have you experienced, and what's your take on the transformation and turnaround models that are mandated? And for example, one of the mandates is that the principal be removed from the school. Where do you think these principals are going? And then where...
Well, Chicago, we got an answer for that.
Right. And then where are the districts to find ideal, qualified, competent turnaround school leaders to fill those positions?
I think it goes right back to Kevin's point around framing, because what we understand in Chicago is that there are communities that understand turnaround models as forms, and I'll go a little hard on this, as forms of systemic violence. And this is what I mean. When a school is closed, or in Chicago we have another term that we use is phased out, which means that they'll stop accepting freshmen at the high school level and graduate everybody out until the building is empty. Or they will close the school, keep a percentage of the same students, and change the entire staff, principal included. Now, in any of those models, what you have if a school is completely closed, you have the student body shifting and going to a school in another neighborhood. In Chicago, that's engineered conflict. And I agree with Carol's point 6,000%, if that is a percentage point, that there are people in central office who understand this. So we really have to, when we're speaking back, we are talking about the politics of disposability. So we're talking about declaring a certain group of students as disposable, because when you put them into the same space, both treated like inmates, you have a self-fulfilling prophecy in that space if you're not critically aware of that context. Now, what central office does in Chicago is ignore that context, and when those fights, quote unquote, happen, now it's a national outrage. Those fights were engineered. And I'll make that point, and I think it's important to make it here at AERA. That is engineered conflict. It's a slow form of violence, right? And these things, and what we're doing, we're dislodging communities. And again, central office, I will not wave my hand and say that they are benign to this fact, right? They know this, because what they can do, that gives them another place to actually close those spaces. And this is what we've done, and this is where research becomes important. In Chicago, we looked at all the turnarounds. And this is the work of Pauline Littman, Janet Smith, Rachel Weber. There's these reports called Data and Democracy that's available through a place called the Institute for Research on the Collaborative for Equity and Justice in Education. And what we did is we just looked at where were schools being turned around or closed. And we looked at new development and housing demolition. We found a 1-to-1 ratio, right? So wherever those schools were being closed, new houses were being put up. And wherever those schools were being turned around, that area was in what folks call in urban planning, in transition, right? So this thing around and connecting that and being very, very clear about that, because again, we know what constitutes quality education. And going back to Carol's point, we're talking about political will, right? And going back to Jeffrey Duncan Andrade's point, how do we engage the process of influencing the enemy, right? And to be that intentional, right? I mean, I can't go to the meeting and say, yeah, you're the enemy, and my job here is to influence you, right? But this thing is to say, now we understand this form of systemic engineered conflict, right? And how do we begin to engage that? Because what they now term that now is the pathology of black and brown youth, right? The deficit model on black and brown youth. But what we've located in Chicago, that's 60 years of engineered conflict based on restrictive covenants, right? And the thing is now, and to put that forward and not engage that as part of that process, I would say is criminal, right? But to really understand how that operates and to be clear, because what we're seeing on the street is young folks being engaged in a particular, not violence amongst each other, but containment by law enforcement, right? So this thing around understanding these things as connected, and when we talk about these turnaround models, I'm always questioning where these places that are being turned around, right? And like your instance in Michigan, I'm thinking about that lower 5%, and in my head I'm thinking, what does that actually mean for Detroit? Right? And how is that connected? Because Detroit is, and we have to talk about it in very real terms, because of the devastation that's happened in Detroit, every day is a testament of black people's ability to survive, right? And what does a school look like in a place where every day is a testament of your ability to survive? So I mean, again, asking those questions not as distanced, but very intimate to us. I apologize for the long answer.
So I want to just take up, I think, Wayne's point about framing the question. There's a great irony at one level in the model that David's explaining, in the sense that one of the short-sightedness that I think that we have as a society is not recognizing the ways in which our divisions undermine everybody's ability to grow. And so the irony in the Chicago model is these communities of regentrification, because the fundamental question of how to build schools as places of learning for all the human beings who are there is not addressed by the system. The replacement schools are not going to keep the middle class people there because they haven't figured out how to make those the kind of spaces that the middle class people want. And so, and one of the ironies of the whole turnaround model is that the system is not built, is not organized to build capacity. So when they close the school down and send out a principal or teacher, they don't have anybody to replace them. And part of this kind of like political social network is that the people, at least on the teacher side, who are typically coming in are going to be the young Teach for America types. Mm-hmm. And I've gotten to a point where I don't necessarily argue against Teach for America in the sense that at least it's attracting people into teaching. That's a positive thing. The problem is that once they get into schools, there's no support for their continued growth and development. And so, and this is the difference in the model in Finland, China, Singapore, all these high-achieving nations organize schools as places where people learn. I remember asking Li Ping Ma years ago, she had done this study comparing math teachers in China, U.S., and elementary school. And I said, well, what is the difference? I just said, it must be something fantastic going on in teacher education. And she said, no, not really. She said the difference is when the new teacher comes into a school in China, first and foremost, all the teachers, only part of the day are they working with kids. There are master teachers in the building who are working with the new teacher over periods of years to learn how to plan, and study to improve practice inside, just as you would in the long, protracted internship in medicine. And it's because the fundamental question of how do you build institutions that enhance learning for all the adults in the institution, the principals, the teachers, the kids, the security guards, who really have to understand human development because they often have much more than. So that's one piece of it. And the other piece of it, I think, David, I'm going to play a little dance here with you. I like to pull out my elder mama thing with you, right? Is that these conditions under which these young people are facing, this whole move, like with the Farragut, not Farragut, but finger thing. Finger was a high school in Chicago where a young man a couple of years ago was literally physically beaten to death by some peers, and part of the conflict had come where they had closed the school down in Altgeld Gardens and had brought kids from Altgeld Gardens into the Finger community. I would argue that that's not the problem. That the problem is, and I'm going to say this from the perspective of black people's history, but I think it has parallel in other communities, is that the conditions of police, that if we look back, black people growing up under Jim Crow, under slavery, there was a socialization, an understanding in communities and schools. You look at Vanessa Siddle Walker's work of saying that it is the job of adults to teach young people when they live in societies where they're going to face racism and stigmatization and all kinds of other biases, to learn how to both understand it, not internalize it, resist it, but also thrive in the midst of it. And that's another piece that the whole focus on the turnarounds and all that doesn't address the question of what does it take to help these young people understand how to live and resist in the world in which they live, which is a world that is filled with all forms of oppression. And if you can't teach young people how to deal with it, you're doing them a disadvantage.
Thank you very much. We are past our time, but I apologize to those of you who still had questions. I want to say thanks to our essayists. Would you join me in recognizing their contributions? And I'd like to say thank you to all of you for coming and for engaging in this dialogue. I hope this has proved a useful use of your time. I would invite you perhaps to go back and take another look at the essays that are still on the website in light of the discussion that we've just had. If you have comments about those essays, there is an email that you can use to send those comments. If you have some thoughts about this kind of experimental session that we've just had, please use that same email address. Pass along your comments there too. If you have some ideas of how we can improve this going forward, we'd love to hear that. Thanks to you. Thanks to the essayists.